Double, double toils and troubles, combat starts and power doubles. Thank the profts that hit the board, and the scholar of Steam Core. Vivi grows and Sphinx's riddle, FOMO discards just a little. Find your hate piece, play it soon, lest this cauldron spells your doom.
It's only void if it's destroyed. Comment below with your favorite card as we get into Week 2 of Edge of Eternities Standard. Oh, hell yeah, I'm back. Dear viewer, I know it's been a long-distance relationship between us for the past 2 months, and I'll be honest, I have not been remotely faithful to the standard format. Dan is just too much damn fun, and if you haven't messed around with that one yet, highly recommend it. But it is time to dial back into standard with Spotlight Orlando looming in the near future. Now, this week, we analyzed 18 tournaments and 144 top 8 slots to bring you the most detailed tier list possible. I'm sure none of you are surprised that Izzet Cauldron took 72 top 8 spots and 9 trophies. That's right, Cauldron took exactly 50% of all top 8 slots and 50% of all trophies, and that is what we call Week 2 dominance. While many of you are already clamoring for bans, we've still got another 6 weeks to go before our next set, so we'll be investigating how to contain this monstrosity.
Dimir Tempo came in second this week with 19 top 8s and 2 trophies of its own. This deck's constant evolution has been a sight to see as it keeps up its number 2 spot. But how long will that last?
Good point. Third place fell to Azorius Control, the hard counter of choice in a meta filled with VVs and Cauldrons. 11 top 8s and 3 trophies highlighted that this deck is a solution worth tuning if Cauldron continues to make waves in the metagame, and I think we all know it will.
Called it on the blue-white. Fourth place went to Esper Pixies, clocking in at 11 top 8s and a single trophy. Cosmogrand Zenith may be great, but that mana base is higher variance than you might think. Shuffler beware.
Tier 2 kicks off with Mono Red Aggro claiming 5 top 8s and a trophy of its own, and while we're all still figuring out how to exist in a world absent Heartfire, Hero, Cutter, and Rage, there's a spicy new build running around featuring Nova Hellkite, so stay tuned.
Sixth place went to Orzhov Control this week with 4 top 8s but no trophies. Ketchermost Control is alive, though it's hard to say it's doing well given how dominant Cauldron and friends are. Still, Deadly Cover-Up's pretty backbreaking in some scenarios, and the Ketamine Machine rolls on.
Mono White Control popped up in 7th place thanks to a single top 8 and trophy. Other archetypes managed an extra top 8 here or there, but I'll take the Lone Wolf who converted and took down the entire tournament over those. Now, it's no secret that Mono White has some issues with other control decks and ramp strategies. Thankfully, the meta is all in on tempo lately, which this build is positioned to answer.
And last but not least, White Weenies snags our final slot with a single top 8 and a trophy of its own. If you fell in love with Enduring Innocence or Cosmogrand Zenith, this deck is for you.
Over in Brewer's Corner, I'll take a look at Una Surprise and Just Guy Manufacturing.
And I'll highlight Simic Control and Temur Battlecryer. But first, let's warp on over to our tier list breakdown, starting with Izzet Cauldron.
Canister managed a perfect record in the 44-player mtga Last Chance qualifier this past Monday with Izzet Cauldron, and while we could have talked about any number of tournament winners, this build in particular intrigues because it was built for the mirror. Yes, the meta is already inbred enough on week 2 that you shave on copies of VV in the main because you can also snag your opponents with your Soul Cauldrons. As you can see here, we have an annul in the main. That's also showing you just how dominant Izzet Cauldron is. The ability to counter FOMO, counter Agathas, these are big deals right now. Countering Profts is also huge. You're hitting key pieces with that card. So you can see how we're just getting into that inbred meta already, Athena. And 3 of Braids, as you can see again, we're getting into that inbred meta where you just have to answer Agathas on impact. You cannot let that sit around, right? We're going up in Steam Core Scholar numbers, down in Tursa numbers here as well. We're starting to see a little bit more of a benefit from having flying. With Twin Moss Storm Brutes floating around, I can see where that pays off some dividends. And Quantum Riddler is there to make sure you don't run out of gas, which you can afford those slots if you put the VVs on the side, which this build does.
Yeah, I mean, speaking of these big flying creatures that are taking slots from the deck, what's the reason for the Meringue River Regent in the shell? It's kind of a newer inclusion we've seen lately.
I think it's a really smart top end because either you're going to have the ability to combo it into something like Profts on turn 4 and just 3+1/+1 counters while you're doing your usual filtering, pumping Mako, facilitating the deck's main engine. It does all of that, albeit at a slightly higher mana cost. But when you get to 6 mana, when you really start popping off with Vivi, the ability to play a 6/7 dragon that bounces, their Soul Cauldron and perhaps their biggest creature means that you are at a distinct advantage in a tempo war for the mirror. So I think that's a huge part of why that's there.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, especially when it comes down to a lot of these creatures get too big for your burn spells to kill, and you don't exactly want to bounce the creatures that are looting.
But we're going to move along, and Athena, can you tell us a little bit about Dimir Tempo?
Of course. Campo smashed through 273 players in Sunday's mtga Showcase Challenge with Dimir Tempo, taking out Izzet Cauldron 3 times straight in the top 8. Well, let's see what they did differently. We are down to 1 Cecil in the main because the life loss can be very punishing against Cauldron and other aggressive decks. And since we're going down this theme of playing these cheaper cards that we want to not get punished by the aggression as much, we got Spell Pierce coming in numbers over Phantom Interference because countering Profts and Cauldron on the draw is really, really, really important. We're playing as many aggressive creatures as possible. We've got this new Sunset Saboteur in the main. It's the 2 mana 4/1 with Ward that can really punish, especially control opponents as that becomes more popular. And we're seeing Stab over some more of the 2 CMC removal because some of the aggression is really popping up back in force.
Absolutely. Now, Athena, I look at this list and I think to myself, Sunset Saboteur, is this actually the real deal or is this just flash in the pan for this week of tech?
I am so cautious to run this card in a main board. I feel like this is a nightmare into the Cauldron matchup as a card, but it's a card that does really, really well into control and other more creatureless matchups. I wouldn't be surprised if it saw more sideboard play coming up, but I would hate to give my opponent's FOMO a counter by swinging.
So basically we're saying if you're in a meta that's, it has a ton of Cauldron, but it also has a ton of like Azorius Control, right? That's where Sunset Saboteur lets you play that rock, paper, scissors game with Dimir. Is that kind of where you're going?
Yeah, pretty much.
Right on. Well, with that, let's move on to exactly Azorius Control, that matchup that Sunset Saboteur is supposedly great against. Let's see what it looks like. Now, Pico MTG grinded through an 88-player MTGO challenge on Tuesday of last week with Azorius Control, beating consecutive Izzet Cauldron opponents to claim their trophy. And I think you can sense a pattern at this point, dear viewer, that you have to take down Izzet Cauldron, and that's just where we're at in the meta. I would fully expect at least 50% of the meta to be Izzet Cauldron going into Orlando because they're not going to ban it quite yet. Let's face it. So, short an emergency ban, that's enemy number 1, as I think we've showcased here. What we're doing to deal with that, we've got the Pinnacle Star Cages. These are huge right now. This is forcing them to have an Abrade and to have an Abrade at exactly the right time so that you don't get to counter it and or counter while copying Star Cage and making another one, right? So you're just wiping the board, and slowly but surely building up to those end game spells like every classic control list does, with Overlord, Meringue, and Elspeth as your main finishers. Occasionally a whale will get there or some Fountain Port tokens, but let's be honest, it's going to be the big 8 there.
Yeah. I look over, and obviously one of the biggest problems with blue-eyed control historically through Standard has been the Dimir Tempo, Dimir midrange, whatever you want to call it, matchup. And this deck, this list decided to go with Voice of Victory in the sideboard. Is this the sideboard piece we really want into Dimir? Is this the card?
I don't know that it's going to be the solution, but I think it's starting to address the issue of being afraid to tap out. It's trying to force them to play a fair game now that cut down's not in the format, and saying, all right, we want No More Lies to not be played on our own end steps so they can't double spell with Curiosity and Tempo us, right? Is it the most efficient way to deal with that? I don't think so. I think we're going to have some evolutions on this deck. It's the early weeks. This is an early solution. It's going to get replaced as things evolve. But for now, it's solid as a placeholder, I would say.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. We'll have to see how it plans to deal with this. There's a couple different pieces you can play between Clarion Conqueror and some other like Dust Animus, things of that sort. But speaking of like random small flyers you can play in response to Dimir, next up we've got Esper Pixies. Kubota K, I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing that, took down Friday's 48-player Champion Cup qualifier in Nagoya, Japan with Esper Pixies, taking out Cauldron in the finals. Now let's dive in. We have cut Fear of Isolation entirely from this list. This is keeping us down to only 8 of the bounce creatures, and instead we're moving over to a full playset of Stock Up, which is really important when you need to get into these grindy games, and you can just bring back your Stock Up over and over with Storm Chaser's talent as you bounce that card. Going down to 1 Momentum Breaker, and then up on the more targeted removal, we got full playsets of Nowhere to Run and Tragic Trajectory, as well as 1 each of Shoot the Sheriff and Bitter Triumph. And this is just because it's so important to take out the key targets as they come down, killing a VV, killing a Steam Core Scholar, etc. That said, the mana base is pretty painful here. Between 8 shocks and 4 starting towns, you're going to take a lot of damage. So just be aware and try to time your lands properly on when you're going to play them.
So, I mean, Athena, we were around for Esper Pixies Advent last year, right? We were there when Kaido was everywhere in Pixies, and now we see just 2 copies sitting in the sideboard. What happened? What happened?
I think because we lost This Town and Hopeless Nightmare as some of the best early game tempo pieces that the deck had, it sort of had to mold more into this control-y shell. This is why you see the full play set of Stock Up. You start to see cards like Cryogen Relic come in. And so when that starts to happen, it's a lot harder for you to play Kaido and justify it in the main, when a lot of these decks are really able to try to go underneath you now. We're not playing the same optimistic Scavenger, Hopeless Nightmare, Pixie we were before. This is 15 removal spell, 8 draw spell Pixie. This is basically a mid-range or control deck at this point.
I mean, that's fair. And you look at it now, and it kind of resembles Jund from back in the day, where everything about the deck is designed to do 2 things. You know, like 2-for-1s, 2-for-1s, 2-for-1s. We're just going to win the resource war at all costs. And as long as the answers line up to the threats, we push ahead, right? So Pixies has kind of become the new Jund in the meta.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I've definitely called it the mid-range deck of the format, if I'm being honest. But we're going to move down over to Mono Red Aggro as we kick off our Tier 2.
Powered by Vanya won Saturday's 36-player MTGO challenge with Mono Red Aggro. Specifically, we're going to call this one Mono Red Dragons, and let's take flight. So, Nova Hellkite, New Ball Lightning on steroids? Hell yes. It's particularly brutal against Dimir Aggro, where 1 toughness can be common. Sunspine Lynx, it's going to underperform against Cauldron. I'm just going to let everybody know that up front, but it is absolutely devastating against Esper Pixies and about half of the Dimir draws that you're going to see. So it takes that spot for game 1, but be ready to board it out against Cauldron, because a lot of the Cauldron decks have shifted over to 12 basics. It's not going to work well there. You have 10 dragons in this list thanks to Torian Mauler, and that's kind of been the new standout. Everybody has looked at this card and wondered, why the hell is this in here? Well, you can behold it with Sarkhan, and it does a really, really nice job of forcing the Izzet player to answer it within 1 spell unless they have Into the Floodmaw, because otherwise those Abrades aren't touching it, and neither are the Torches, and this is just going to build.
So in the past, we've seen Red change its 5 damage removal spell over and over. We've seen Witchstalker's Frenzy, we've seen Scorching Shot. Now the one that everyone's playing is Twin Maw, and that doesn't hit any flying creatures. So with that being the 5 damage removal spell of choice, can we start seeing cards like Lyra Dawnbringer, Bonehorde Dracosaur come back into sideboards that are more traditional counters to the Red matchup?
I think it somewhat depends on where Red wants to focus. Red has the tools to beat a lot of different archetypes in the format, but it does not have the ability to beat all of the archetypes in the format. So you have to pick which matchups you want to focus on, right? And this build to me screamed, I want to beat Pixies, I want to beat Dimir, and I'm willing to coin flip with Cauldron. I don't think that's going to be true after this week. I think that was an early draft of this deck, and when you get to a later draft, you're going to see a very different build.
That's fair. This deck is entirely new. It's kind of taken everyone by storm, and cards like Torian Mauler are really impressive sometimes. They're real sleepers. You got to watch out for them.
Absolutely. And with that, let's get over and talk about Orzhov Control.
Seigo Kenji made it to the top 8 of the 42-player Champions Cup qualifier in Osu, Japan with Orzhov Control. Let's take a peek at what this deck looks like. We've got a lot of exile removal, extraction effects, and graveyard hate. This is a deck designed in its core to beat Cauldron. We've got a playset of Unholy Annex for the grind, because alongside Ketramos, the biggest problem with Ketramos decks is that they just didn't have enough card draw when Ketramos couldn't land. Annex helps really solve that problem, and to complement the Annex, you're going to see a full playset of Soulstone Sanctuary in the sideboard, and this is one of those consequences of Orzhov mana just being some of the best in the format right now. And you may be wondering, well, how does this sort of deck beat something like Blue-White Control? Well, this person took this deck and added 4 Duress to the main board, specifically to attack those control matchups and other similar sorts of shells.
Oh, absolutely. Now, I look at this Athena, and like Ketramos, when you're playing against blue and red colors, feels amazing. Enjoy your Abrades, you're never getting it, right? But we're also in a format that's going to play Tragic Trajectory, as we saw with Dimir. They're playing playset in the main now. So can Ketramos-based control exist as a Tier 1 archetype when every black-based removal deck loves Tragic Trajectory right now?
I'm really skeptical. I mean, I would say if you can find a way to like maybe reasonably board out the Ketramos in those matchups, or find some other way to beat it consistently, I would be willing to bet this deck probably doesn't have a bad Pixie matchup, and that deck runs 4 trajectories just because this deck grinds really well, and you could probably reasonably board out the Ketramoses. But in terms of things like Dimir, yeah, that's got to be a nightmare matchup.
Yeah, it's not fun. It's not fun. Anyway, we're going to move it right along and talk a little bit about Mono White Control, my favorite. And honestly, at this point, it's my favorite because I get to show off this art. Yep, I'm bougie like that. But I apologize, I'm going to butcher this name. It's, I believe, Aikawa Tomoyuki won the 37-player Champions Cup qualifier in Fukuoka, Japan this past Saturday with Mono White Control. Now let's investigate this blast from the past. Caretaker's Control is back, and this time it has Star Cage instead of Lockdown. But for some odd reason, this build chose to run only 1 copy and put an Ultima on the sideboard. A little confusing on that front. Not sure I agree with all the choices, but again, it's an early draft. We're just a couple weeks into the meta, so don't judge too heavily. All the same, you've got Caretakers, you've got Enduring Innocence, you've got Voice of Victory triggering both, you've got Beza triggering both pretty often, and you've got Overlord of the Mistmores triggering both. So you've got all of these triggers for these engines, and it's just a question of, can you slow your opponent down and start grinding right through them, because that is what this deck does best. I'm not saying that it's going to beat anything control-based or anything ramp-based, but if you are just trying to house tempo and aggro, this is your Huckleberry.
Because I think we've discussed enough times my disdain for this deck and how it just builds hype over and over again, and everyone talks about it's going to be this great menace, and then it shows up week 1, and then it just falls flat. Is it going to be the same thing here? Is this just a flash in the pan? Are we going to see this next week? What's different? What do you think is the thing that lets this deck kind of flourish in this format?
The question everybody has to ask is, how do you beat Cauldron? Because whichever archetypes beat Cauldron are really the only archetypes that are viable right now. And so basically you've created this meta, right? Tier 1, basically Tier 0 almost, is Cauldron. And then everything else is designed around it to some degree. But it heavily has to anticipate and deal with it. Lots of decks are pre-boarded against it at this point, right? So I look at White Control and Azorius Control, and I don't think either of those decks are necessarily Tier 1 outside of a Cauldron meta, but we have a Cauldron meta. So as long as we maintain the dominance of Cauldron, it's kind of like where Orzhov Pixie was playing a hard counter to Cutter. Orzhov Pixie was not the best version of Pixie necessarily, but in that meta, it was better than Esper Pixie in that meta. So I think that's where we're going with these decks that are so linear. They're linear because you have to interact and beat Cauldron at all costs, and then it's just a question of what's the best Tier 2 deck that beats Cauldron, right? And we don't know yet. That's something we're still sort of figuring out.
Yeah, I can see that. Time will tell if this deck is gonna be good after this week. I would rather just play some of the other control decks against Cauldron. I have zero faith in this deck, but we'll see. We'll see. Maybe we'll get somewhere. My favorite type of mono white deck, honestly, is the one that we're gonna have coming up now, which is White Weenie. Nice little real blast from the past here. Bolov Zero won Friday's 60-player MTGO challenge with White Weenie, shocking the world with the return of an old staple in Magic the Gathering lore. And let's look at why. This is a grindier version than most Weenie decks you've probably seen. So many of the cards are looking to get this incremental advantage turn over turn. You have your Cosmogrand Zeniths looking to pump token or make tokens or pump your team every turn. You're looking at Enduring Innocence drawing you cards. You have Starfield Shepherd that can go search your deck for some pieces. You kind of have this like little toolboxy one-drop suite because of that. We're playing 4 Seam Rips as our removal spell. Usually White Weenie decks, like things like Mono White Humans and Pioneer, would run portable holes in the sideboard against aggro. But Seam Rip in the main as a 4 of is this pretty big nod to Cauldron. Really great card against that. And one thing that I really like about this list is if you take a look at it, especially as you look into the sideboard, you're really able to play the control role well in aggro mirrors with things like Day of Judgment.
Yeah, you're not wrong. Now, I look at it, though, and again, this is an aggressive deck, but for some reason there are 3 Fountain Ports in it. So, Athena, is this the deck that truly wants Fountain Port, in your opinion?
I do like Fountain Port in this deck. I'm just not sure if I like the full 3, and I think I definitely like more Soulstone Sanctuaries before I run any Fountain Port. If we're on 3 Elspeths, or 2 Elspeths, whatever this deck is on, Fountain Port gets a lot better, so it could act as this sort of top-end card.
Okay, I could see that. That makes a lot of sense. And with that, we get to my favorite segment every week, Brewer's Corner. Let's kick things off. Talk a little bit about Yuna Surprise. So, credit goes out first and foremost, Mog Flunkies, nicely done, top 8ing with this, but also to who they got it from. Hermes, well played on building this one from scratch and being the first person to get it into a tournament so that everyone else got to see it and copy. Well played. So, Yuna Surprise, why is this better than other Yuna decks? I think when you really boil it down, it attacks from 2 different angles. The first angle is, of course, can you cheat something into the graveyard for Yuna to reanimate? You've got the Bitter Triumphs, you've got the Dredger's Insights. You've got ways to push into that, Overlord of the Balemark even, right? But you also have this card called Smuggler's Surprise. So if they cut off the graveyard with all those Soul Cauldrons and Ghost Vacuums and interaction, you can just say, screw it, let's just cheat it all into play. You know, let's Smuggler Surprise in a couple of Bahamats and see what happens. So you've got this sneak and show angle to combine with the reanimation angle, and it's clever. It's clever, and it's going to catch a lot of people by surprise in game 1. And again, if they want to play fair, you're fine with that. You're a ramp deck, right? Eventually, these cards are getting cast no matter what. You don't have just a way to cheat it in. Your late game plan is bigger and better than most people's.
Yeah, I think this deck is a nice little nod to the fact that one of the best counters to the Jeskai Oculus deck, which is similar enough-ish to Cauldron, was Domain. That was one of the things people used to play into it. So I think playing this deck is kind of reminiscent of trying to hit that counter matchup in some weird way.
I would agree. It's just kind of how it rolls. But with that, let's get over to Simic Control.
All right, this deck is by Peter H. Masters, who took this Simic Ramp Control deck to a 4th place finish in a 60-player MTGO challenge this last Friday. And if we're talking going over the top of the rest of the format, this is the deck to do it. We have 4 Ugins in the main board. So once you get to that top end, you're finishing the game. This is going to seal the deal. This deck makes really great use of a lot of the pieces along the way, too. Anti-Causal Vestige, in particular, is a really good card that you really need to be careful of what shells you're putting this in, but this hits it really well. You can hit Meringue River Regents, you can hit Overlords, and these are cards that are both useful as their permanent side to be hit by that, and as more of the spell side to be used earlier in the game to get you up to where you need to be. If you're looking at the removal in Simic, usually it's pretty lacking, and especially against things like a Resolved Vivi, but this deck is running Fresh Start, which seems like really, really spicy tech against it.
Yeah. Okay, that's a fascinating list. I had not actually tuned in and looked at that all that carefully, but that's a spicy one. Mm-hmm. But speaking of that, let's get to another spicy one and talk about Jeskai Weapons. So, 9th place in an MTGO challenge and 5th place in MTGO Last Chance. This is a deck that finally understands how to use Repurposing Bay. Weapons manufacturing was the missing piece for this card to really pop off without having to go all the way up to 6. It plays a nice low-end game of just value, value, value with weapons manufacturing, playing this role of, improv essentially. Yes, and like you get to upgrade your thing. Also 2 points. Also 2 points. So this is set up pretty well for Cauldron. You've got 9 early pieces of removal with 2 top ends at 3 mana. I don't necessarily love Phantom Train being our 4 of at the top. I feel like we can do better, but again, early drafts we'll find out. Litho Breaking. This is fascinating when you get to combine it with cards like weapons manufacturing. So clever, very clever. I don't know. It's just an interesting list that's going very low end on repurposing bay, and we've not seen that done before. Usually we see, the Boomobile combos, or people get really greedy with synthesizer, and this is the first one to say, no, weapons manufacturing's fine. We don't have to go any bigger.
Yeah, honestly, I'm a big fan of the Phantom Train. I've played a good amount of this deck on the ladder at this point and talked in the Discord about it. The Phantom Train is there as just your finisher. If you have 4 or 5 of these munitions tokens sitting around, they can't stop the Phantom Train once it's on the board. It's just going to be able to instant speed, sacrifice all of them, and nuke your opponent.
So literally, you can't stop the A train is the fucking deck. I love it.
Yeah, unless you have a suplex.
Oh god, I love it. All right, and with that, we get to, I believe, our final one here, Temur Battlecry.
Credit to Jay Reddy, who took top 16 of the MTGO Last Chance qualifier with this updated Battle Crier combo deck. And these new versions have been pretty interesting. We're getting to see anti-causal vestige in here, which lets you play this kind of grindy ramp game when you can't hit your combo, which really works well with what the deck is trying to do. And to complement that, now we're seeing Quantum Riddlers in the main too as a 4-of, as this can draw you cards, it triggers your Trailblazer, and while it's warped, it can crew your World Wagon, and it's a 1-mana creature once you do start comboing off with your Battle Criers. We've got our main board Abrade, as is pretty common with any deck running red nowadays. You gotta be able to kill that Cauldron at instant speed. And, I mean, looking at this sideboard is something else. We've got an Ugin in here. We can go really over the top still, and with all the ramp this deck has, you're gonna be able to hit it pretty easily.
I love that they're playing Spectral Denials. That's such a spicy thing to do when you're playing Battle Crier. That's well played. Well played indeed. But that's going to bring us to our final segment, Ahead of the Curve. Now, Athena, we've looked at 12 archetypes in our recap. What are you playing at RCQs in Week 3 of Edge of Eternities Standard?
You know me, Rictus. I've got to rep some roots. I'll be playing Golgari Roots. The biggest draw to this deck for me, honestly, is being able to run 4 Scavenging Ooze in the main board. This card is such a house against Cauldron. It gets too big for their burn spells to kill. Bouncing it feels pretty bad because it's only 2 mana. You can activate it to try to exile something, and then they can't really activate Cauldron in response because you can just activate it again in response. This card's a house. But around it, you still have a really good shell. The Insidious Roots value train is here still, and it keeps going pretty well. You can pump out a bunch of roots really fast. You get the multiples of Esper Origins to help you finish the game once you do have that wide board. And the tech I've been really liking is that sneaky Vanille and Fang meld. These cards individually work as like somewhat worse versions of cards we have, but with all the recursion you have in the deck, you're able to just keep bringing them back over and over and threatening your opponent to be forced to kill them each turn. Otherwise, you get this 7/6 Vigilance, Menace, Trample, Reach, Haste that threatens to end the game pretty quick.
I love that you get to end the game with Ragnarok. That feels so goddamn perfect. So I'm super in for this. This is Viking lore now. This is how you get to Valhalla with magic, and I'm all about it. But let's move to the very last deck here. All right, folks, you know me, mono red aggro. Let's fucking go. So I hate losing to Cauldron, and I just want that to be clear from the outset. This is pre-boarded for Cauldron. You do not have to board a single card to beat them. Yes, there are 4 Dreadmaw's Ire. Yes, we're playing Taurian Mauler, and in this deck, we don't care that it's a dragon. We care that it is a mouse. This is build your Heartfire hero at home spell. I know it's a little janky, but I promise you, it still feels kind of disgusting when this hits 4/4/5/5, and then you get to Offspring a Manifold Mouse and swing for 10. So this is trying to solve the issue that the Mono Red Dragons list above was having, which is that it's going too far up the curve, and it's not doing what it's supposed to be doing against Cauldron consistently. This build acknowledges that Nova Hellkite's great against a lot of the format, but it's not great against anything in Cauldron. You're not going to get those Makos at 1. They're not leaving it for that on turn 3. I know it's a beautiful fantasy. It's never happening, dear viewer. Just don't even try. But this build in particular, it's a neutered red. I get that, but it's also probably the only aggro deck I've found that can keep on pace with Cauldron and actually go over the top.
The more I look at Tari and Mauler and different red shells, the more I love it. I mean, it's even a lizard for Hired Claw. Like this thing it hits all of your random synergies you can throw in your deck.
God, you had to do the lizard quote right when it's the TikTok trend. Well played, Athena. Well played.
You know me. Well, that's our second week of Edge of Eternities in the books. With Cauldron as dominant as it is, make sure that whatever it is that you're playing this week, it has a solid plan to beat that powerhouse.
Last but not least, please like, share, and comment on this video to show support for your competitive community. We appreciate having all of you here, and we'll see you next week.
And until next time, untap, upkeep,
Resist.